So Janessa's going to introduce our panelists here, and then we'll give them a chance to speak, and then we'll ask them some questions, and then we'll open up the questions to you all.
Great. Okay. Good morning, everyone. And this is really exciting. This is going to help us connect a lot of this personal to global transformation and give us tangible examples of that. So we have an amazing group of panelists here. I think yesterday Mark was saying, all right, you guys ready to just totally blow this out of the water and open it up and take it to a new level? And so I think they are ready. So we're going to start some quick bios. Sami Awad on the end is a Palestinian Christian living in Bethlehem with his wife and 3 daughters. He's the executive director of Holy Land Trust, a Palestinian nonprofit organization established in Bethlehem in 1998. Through a commitment to the principles of nonviolent action, HLT seeks to strengthen and empower the Palestinian community in developing spiritual, pragmatic, and strategic approaches that will allow it to resist all forms of oppression and build a future that makes the Holy Land a global model and pillar of understanding, respect, equality, and peaceful coexistence. Mark Siljander here in the middle is a former Republican congressman from Michigan, a deputy UN ambassador, and has traveled to over 130 countries. Mark's odyssey from an anti-Muslim evangelical Christian conservative to a peacemaking pioneer won him the Mohandas Gandhi International Peace Award in 1996. He's also written the best-selling book, A Deadly Misunderstanding, A Congressman's Quest to Bridge the Muslim-Christian Divide. He's the current chairman of an NGO called Track 5, A Bold Path to Peace. Here on my left is Rabbi Dale Schreiber, whose work focuses on advocacy, resiliency, and identifying resources for healing and wholeness. Her approach underscores the importance of integrating 4 realms of personal reality, kind of like our 4 dimensions of global transformation: the physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. She has served Barnes Jewish Hospital as interfaith chaplain and as coordinator for Jewish care for 9 years. Her journey to the rabbinate included a profession as a clinical audiologist and a subsequent metamorphosis into Jewish education. It was during this time that she became interested in student-centered learning, best practices, and writing curriculum from a peace and justice perspective. She has served the St. Louis Jewish community in a number of leadership roles since 1985. She's also a member of the St. Louis Rabbinical Association and the National Association of Jewish Chaplains. So we're going to start with you, Rabbi Schreiber, and just from your perspective, could you open up this topic of transformation this morning?
I can, but I can't do it sitting down because rabbis have to stand.
That's great.
So I want to say Bruchim Habaim, Bruchot Habaot, blessings on our arrival here and on all the energy that we bring to the topic of transformation. So this is an etrog. It is a citron grown in Israel. It's used during Sukkot, the 8-day Thanksgiving festival that we just completed. And all we do is take a whiff because it smells delicious and we're supposed to surround ourselves with beauty. And so I'm going to pass this around and know that when you take it in, you're taking in a little bit of where it came from. And when you breathe out, you're breathing out a little of the inspiration that comes to you in that moment. And so when you breathe in, express a hope. And when you breathe out, express a bigger hope so that your neighbor can share in the hope that you allow on that out-breath. So I'm going to start right here. So transformation for me is about a shift in perception that once it happens, it doesn't allow you to ever go back in looking at the same thing in the same way. And the transformation moment that I'll share with you is Hagar and Ishmael. And so the Jewish text has a number of characters in it, and some of them are mainstream, and some of them are placed outside or peripheral to the story. And in the placing of them at a distance, that distance gets amplified over time. And in that amplification, there are voices that come from the tradition which vilify or somehow create a difficulty in being able to embrace the difference or the other. And so my relationship with Hagar is that she is an Egyptian handmaiden, and she is assigned a role, and her name, which in Hebrew comes from the root which means ger, to be a sojourner, to be passing through the story, could be viewed as kind of just a temporary placement in the story to achieve a certain end. But in Aramaic, her name means reward, as in a noble gift. And so a few years ago, when I was recovering from some surgery, I couldn't write the 20-page paper for my Midrash class. So I decided to sit down and create something visual that represented the deep yearning in me to heal some of the breaches or the distances in the story. And so in this story, Hagar has been exiled, and there was a term that we used before, which is to be fully awake is to be continually thrown out of the nest. And so in this saga, Hagar is exiled along with her son Ishmael, and she sees her destiny dying, and she is truly in despair, and those water bags that Abraham threw over her shoulder are really emptied, and in their place is her womb. And her womb is slung out there so that her destiny, her lost destiny, is weeping. And that angel in the story is present as an aspect of compassion. And Ishmael, who is an archer and who is in suspended animation, who has not yet met his destiny, is really waiting to know what the direction will be. And Hagar, in her own place and in her own despair, and in a moment of what she believes to be futility, is told that if she could only open her eyes, everything that she needs has been there all along. And so that weeping of that rechem, that place of compassion, which is where we give life, becomes the wellspring that is able to sustain her. And Ishmael, who is really the first child of the tradition, the first child of Abraham, who is the first to be inscribed with a holy mark of circumcision, is given an equal legacy in the tradition. 12 tribes, a whole nation. How would our story be different if we understood that the matriarchs of our shared common sacred story are really noble characters who have been written out because of the way in which the political challenges of each period have allowed us to distance themselves. So yesterday we heard about othering, and this is really about mothering. And it was a way for me to mother Hagar back into the story and to act as a midwife so that I can claim her as a noble ancestor who was equally present. But again, in the story, how are you going to promote the promise if we don't spread the seed? And we can't do it if we're just sitting in this room. We have to go out and manifest that potential. And so my blessing, I think, is that you find those places that need redemption, and you redeem them from the servitude that they had and give them a new place so that you really can renew your attachment to them and write a better story that you can live more fully.
Go for it, Mark.
All right. up, sit down.
Your call, whatever you like.
I'll start sitting down.
Lie
We'll see
down.
how it goes in 3 minutes. I'm going to start the story by relating to some of you. I was born and raised a Christian Scientist in the Chicago area and transformed into a political person. Ran for public office in college and got elected by 1 vote, big landslide. And then got elected 3 times to the State House and 3 times to the U.S. House in Washington. And during the National Prayer Breakfast, the Quran was read, and I was so angry. I was an evangelical Christian Zionist who was very upset and thought that anything to do with Islam was definitely the devil. So as a consequence, I wrote a fiery letter off to the titular chairman of the National Prayer Breakfast, just insulting him and so forth in certain verbiage for having the gall to allow the Saudi ambassador to read the Quran. Anyway, make a long story short, he came to my office and asked me a few questions that were definitely transformative. So I had transformed from Christian Science to evangelical. Who knows what's coming next, right? So anyway, he said, now, have you ever read the Quran? Now, that's a practical question for someone who's so definitive on something. And I fancied myself as a young, up-and-coming congressman. And in my total arrogance said, no, hadn't read it. As you probably guessed already. Then he said the second question, which was a catapult into a whole different dynamic of thinking. He said, so what is your strategy for Islam anyway? I said, well, my strategy for Muslims, we need to convert them to the Christian religion, and that's the strategy. And he said to me, have you read the Bible? Now that one I could say definitely yes. I was very arrogant about that too. I said, yes, I've read the Bible many times. And he said, well, where did you get your strategy then? I said, what do you mean? I just told you, I read the Bible. The strategy to convert Muslims to Christianity comes from the Bible. He said, but where? Can you name one verse? Silence is powerful, isn't it? I couldn't think of a single verse and felt totally humiliated. Basically, in a nice way, threw him out of my office. But I thought to myself, why couldn't I think of a single verse? I believed the Quran was the devil. Why? Because I was said that. I was told that over and over by others, but never confirmed it for myself. The strategy was to convert Muslims or whomever to the Christian religion, but couldn't think of a single verse to back up this dogmatic, adhered to, totally believed strategy. So I felt completely embarrassed and started reading the Bible a second time and a third time over 1 year so I could redeem myself and write a whole letter to this man who came to my office and prove him wrong. And guess what? I couldn't prove him wrong. I proved him absolutely correct. I couldn't find a single verse. Jesus never mentioned the word religion once. He never mentioned the word Christian once. He never mentioned the word Christianity once. And Jesus spoke the beloved language of Aramaic, which is the cross between the Arabic and the Hebrew. And the Aramaic language has been, studying it has been an absolute another level of personal transformation. In studying had spoken a little Hebrew because, being a Zionist Christian, I had to speak some Hebrew and be able to pray some of the Hebrew prayers. So I began studying a little bit of the Arabic and started studying Aramaic. And it was absolutely stunning to find out when I read the Quran in English and read the Bible in English, they seemed in very critical, key theological precepts to clash like this. But when one takes the Aramaic and the Arabic of the Quran and the Hebrew of the Torah, they begin interweaving in a beautiful, much more comprehensible, common ground sense. So that sent me off the trajectory to begin analyzing the holy books from the Semitic linguistic perspective. In the meantime, I needed to learn more Arabic, and I didn't know Sami at the time. But I did happen to bump into a black Sudanese sheikh, scholar of Islam from Chicago. Now, you talk about total opposites in every way conceivable. He and I started hanging out together. And we started studying the Quran and the Bible together from the Arabic and the Aramaic perspective. He didn't know Aramaic, but I would bring that, he'd bring the Arabic. And he told me, and I'm going to conclude with this, he said, 15 years ago, Mark, I wouldn't walk across the street to spit on you because you were kafir, meaning an infidel. He He said, now you're my achi, my brother. I said, achi, brother? I said, 15 years ago, I wouldn't even cross the street to Spenny. I'd do it from a distance. So he and I began not only a spiritual odyssey or transformation. First, it started with internal. Then it started with another. Then we had a smaller group that formed. And then we started traveling different places of the world. We went to Sudan. We went many places, particularly in the Islamic and Christian world, in Europe and others, to begin taking what fostered our internal transformation and our transformation as two polar opposites in everything, culturally, spiritually, physically, thinking-wise, every way, even cuisine. We had hardly anything in common at the beginning, and what brought us together. And I'll conclude really with this story. We went to Geneva not too long ago to a dialogue. King Abdullah puts on many dialogues, interfaith, has the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, the Catholics. Anyway, they're all speaking, and the head of the World Muslim League was sort of the MC. After 3 days, we sat across, we sat together. I said, Your Excellency, this has been a wonderful conference. I said, but frankly, I'm not leaving transformed. I heard what the Jews believe, the Christians believe, the Shiites believe, the Catholics believe, the Sunnis believe, the Buddhists believe, but we are no more closer together than we were the day I arrived. And I said, frankly, when you look at me, what do you think? And he says, kafir, means infidel. I said, that's my point. You still look at me the same way. Now let me ask you a simple question, Your Excellency, in due respect. What makes you think I'm a kafir? We said, well, you're a Christian. I said, well, that's my background. He said, well, Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God. They believe that the deity of Jesus and the Trinity. I said, so that makes me, in your view, an infidel. He says, yes. I said, the irony is, with all due respect, people of my ilk would say the same about you. So we're even. I said, now what if, in the next 10 minutes, you and I could come to as much agreement as Christians do amongst ourselves on all three of those issues? He looked at me like I had lost my mind. He said, that is not possible. We've been fighting for 1,400 years. Gulf, mistrust, wars, hatred, crusades, and so forth. And you're telling me, a politician from Washington, that in 10 minutes we can bridge this massive gulf of theology and misunderstanding? I said, exactly. He says, well, I've got 20 minutes, go ahead. So in 12 minutes, that took 2 minutes longer than I'm doing now, but 12 minutes later, he looked at me and said, if this is true, it would change the world. So this is the excitement of this process, from internal to a few, to a core, to starting to influence, hopefully, God willing, inshallah, God willing, we influence cultures. And bringing the faith much closer together to common ground. Thank you so much.
My turn, and I'll stand. Oh, look at me. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, an honor to be on such a panel and after so many wonderful speakers that we heard yesterday. I have to admit that up until the last moment, I was thinking of what example to share with you when it comes to transformation, because as you said, it's a continuous process. And I could think actually of examples from the time I was 12 years old, when I experienced my first protest and my first interaction with an Israeli soldier, and how I dealt with that, to just a few weeks ago, experiencing transformation and meeting with people and being enlightened by them, even yesterday as well, with everything that we've heard. But what I want to share is one very specific example that for me is the most powerful example of transformation that has happened in my life, that has completely flipped me over as a person and challenged me to the core of understanding my identity, especially the political identity of being Palestinian and what it meant to be a Palestinian. As many of you know, I am a person who grew up my life committed to nonviolence. Many people are transformed from being violent to being nonviolent. I wasn't that. I grew up in a family that was always insisting on me and my siblings and my cousins that we should always seek path and reconciliation with our enemy. We should never engage in acts of violence towards our enemy, and our enemy being the Israeli military and occupation that we face as Palestinians. Even though our family had suffered tremendously. My grandfather was killed in the 1948 war. My father's family became refugees. They lost everything, all their belongings, and they became refugees living in Bethlehem. But I grew up in that environment, in that family that taught me that violent revenge and retaliation was not going to achieve anything. And that first protest, I was 12 years old when I joined an uncle of mine who was very active in nonviolence in Palestine. His name is Mubarak. And I grew up in that field. When my uncle was deported from the land because of his work in nonviolence in 1988, seeing him arrested, seeing him in shackles, going to his court, witnessing the Israeli peace groups that came in solidarity with him and for him was very transformative in my life at that age. And it was at that time when I saw him arrested and deported, but I saw him living in absolute peace in a process where he did not know what was going to happen to him. He could have been sentenced to prison for many years, but he lived in absolute peace. I decided at that point that I wanted to commit my life to nonviolence. I began studying nonviolence. I came to the US, where I did my undergraduate degree in political science, and then studied peace and conflict resolution, and then went back home to serve the community in nonviolence. Now, the nonviolence I engaged in and promoted was about resistance. How can we as Palestinians develop strategies and tactics of resistance? Protests, demonstrations, boycotts. How can we expose the occupation? How can we humiliate the occupation for what it is? How can we resist and fight the occupation, but again, not using physical violence? This is how I began to engage in nonviolence. It's pragmatic, that we don't have weapons, we don't have bombs, we don't have F-16 fighter jets, so pragmatically the option for us is nonviolent. Strategically for us, the option is, of course, nonviolence, because our strength is in our people. Our strength is not in our organized military, which we don't have, or in our organized militias, which were very poor equipped until this day. So strategically, again, the best option was nonviolence. So for many, many years, from the year I started Homeland Trust, this is what we were promoting. And for me, it felt very transformative because we were seeing this at a time when many Palestinians were not accepting nonviolence. Many Palestinians felt and believed that violence and armed resistance, suicide attacks were the option of resistance. So it was sort of an ego thing for me to say, no, we are promoting something that is beyond violence, that is nonviolence. Well, this was the process until a few years ago when I had this experience that I want to share with you. When I was invited by friends of mine from the US to join them in a retreat that they do in Poland called the Bearing Witness Retreat. And this is a retreat where they bring people from around the world to come and bear witness to what happened in the Holocaust, in the death camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it was an incredible experience. It was a life-changing experience. I went there very hesitant because for me, as a Palestinian growing up, you never really affiliated yourself with the trauma of the occupier because you wanted always to show your side as the victim and how they are the bad people. And going there, in a sense, meant that you had to excuse what they were doing to you if you acknowledged the Holocaust. We don't have Holocaust denials in Palestine because we actually like to say that we are the victims of the victims. We are the victims of the most victimized people in the world. But I took that step and went there. And it was life transforming for me to be 10 days witness to the reality, or to as close as possible, the reality of what happened in Auschwitz. Not to Jews, but to many people, but of course, being a person who engages with Jews and Israelis for that particular group. to see the chambers where people's bodies were burned, to see the bunkers where people were imprisoned. One very powerful image was the children's bunker, where they kept all the children. And for the children to be able to create a sense of childhood in such a situation, they drew pictures of children that were playing games, kicking a ball or riding a bicycle, so that they, as children, would remember what it meant to be a child in such a very deadly and very destructive area. But for me, my transition wasn't in just understanding the tragedy of the Holocaust as a past experience. The biggest influence during that trip was being witness to how the Holocaust was presented to many Israeli children that are given a free trip to come and visit Auschwitz and Birkenau by their government. These children, 13 to 16 years old, are given a free trip to come and see what happened to their great-grandparents or great-uncles and aunts. And they walk off the bus with a big Israeli flag wrapped around every child, and they walk. If you haven't been to Auschwitz and Birkenau, you might remember the film Schindler's List, the railroad track. That's Birkenau. So they walk there singing very patriotic, nationalistic songs, and then they're given a tour of the site. And you could see the shock on their face happen as they experience the trauma of their ancestors or from their great uncles and aunts and grandparents. Then the children are put in a circle, and the Israeli teachers or guides stand in every circle and begin to explain to them and talk to them about what happened there. And they explain in a very powerful way the tragedy of the Holocaust, what happened, what the Germans did to us, how their grandparents were killed, how their uncles and aunts. And many of these children had this, they are family members of those generations. But the shock for me was in seeing also how these teachers, how these guides were also telling their children that this was not just their history. That what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in Poland, in Auschwitz, was also their present and their future. And that it's about security, it's about strength, and that if we break down, if we allow this to happen, the Arabs, the Muslims, the Palestinians will do the same thing to us as the Nazis did to your great uncles and aunts. This was the shock for me. This was the moment of deep transformation. For me to look at these children and seeing what they are going through, understanding the trauma of their history, but realizing and being taught that this is not just their history, this is their present and their future. And that they have to be strong, and they have to be forceful, and they cannot trust anybody outside of their circle. And for me to realize that this child who just experienced this is going to go back to his home in Israel. After he finishes high school, he's going to go into the army. He's going to be given the only tools to deal with this potential threat, which are not even tools of nonviolence, they're tools of violence. And when he's 18 years old, he's going to be given a gun, a machine gun, thrown at a checkpoint, and told by his commander, now deal with the enemy. As a Palestinian, when I used to go to a checkpoint, or used to go to a demonstration or a protest in what I call nonviolence, I would look at that 18, 19-year-old boy or girl, soldiers with their machine guns, fully armed and fully covered as the enemy. And even in my nonviolence, I had hatred towards them. Now, every time I go to a demonstration and to a protest, and yes, we still do many of these demonstrations and protests, I cannot look at that person as an enemy. I cannot look at that soldier as an evil person who wants to kill me. I can only look at that person with full compassion and desire for healing them in the pain that they have suffered. And in the trauma of the past, it's sad to say, in the manipulation of the trauma that exists today. I have to prove that what their teachers were telling them when they were 13 years old, what their politicians are telling them today, what their media is telling them about a Palestinian is wrong. It's not just to say it, that it's wrong, I have to prove through my actions and my words in every interaction I have with an Israeli that I am not the enemy. And for me, to sum up, the transformation for me has been in realizing that I, as a Palestinian, cannot demand freedom from an Israeli society that continues to be imprisoned in the past, until I am ready to become an agent of healing and closure for the trauma and the past experiences of the Israeli Jewish community and the suffering. I, as a Palestinian, will never attain my freedom. Thank you.